Good morning, or afternoon, I guess, at this point. Thank you all so much for being here. This is such a treat to get a chance to visit with you. And thank you to our panelists. We're going to be talking today about the future of work, about what it looks like to come back to the office after being away for a number of years. My name is Charles Duhigg. I'm a reporter at the New Yorker magazine, and I'm going to introduce our panelists in one moment. Before I do, I'm hoping to make this kind of a conversation with all of you guys. So let me just take a quick poll before we start. How many of you are back in an office? You're going back into an office after, okay, a pretty good number. How many of you are happy that you're going back into an office? Same number of hands. How many of you have young children at home, which I think is really highly correlated? Yeah, I find the same thing. Well, we're going to be talking about this today because obviously we are living in a completely different world in terms of how we spend our time, where we do our work, what that means for building culture and community within companies. We have three folks who are running companies, who talk to companies all the time, and let's just dive into it if you don't mind. I'm going to start with you, Jackie Welch, who is the Chief Human Resource Officer at the New York Times Company. You joined in 2021 and started your career, as I understand it, as a merchant at Lord & Taylor.
Yes, sir.
So if you have any questions about clothes, hopefully we can ask you. So let me start with this. You just joined the Times a little bit over a year ago. The newsroom was closed for 2 years. I worked at the Times for 14 years. What's the best thing you learned in the last 2 years? Like, what are you excited about that the last 2 years revealed to you?
So it's I'd like to just, thank the Aspen Institute for the opportunity to be here and thank all of you all for choosing our discussion topic. And I'm hopeful that you will take Charles up on his answer and engage with us. That'll make it far more energizing and helpful, I think. It's such a nuanced question. It's important to say that I joined the Times in January 2021. So I have no idea what it was like prior to the pandemic, right? So I'm not transitioning to something. I'm creating something completely new for me, right? The thing I would say, though, in the almost 2 years that I've been at the New York Times, and I think it's true for most organizations, I've not read of one single company that has fallen to its knees because people weren't in an edifice, which I think it's really important to sort of maintain a focus on that, because in order to have people come back to the office, clearly the value proposition can't be, we can't do business if people aren't here. We've now proven that for 2 years to be patently false. Yeah. And so now I think it's important for organizations and the leadership of organizations to really dig in and sort of inhabit, what do we want to create in an office that's going to be so compelling that the average person is going to leave the comfort of their home with their favorite snacks chosen by them 10 feet away. So that's, I think, the charge. That's the thing that I've learned. We've really got to hyper-focus on what is culture and why it's important for us to inhabit it together.
That the office has to be a selling point as opposed to the default, which sets me up for Stewart, because Stewart Butterfield is the CEO and founder of Slack. Many of you probably are familiar with. Just 2 years ago now, you guys got acquired by Salesforce, but you're still running the company as CEO. And grew it from just a handful of people to a multi-billion-dollar company with how many employees did Slack have when you guys sold to Salesforce?
I think about 2,500 versus 3,500 or so now.
Okay. So I want to ask you the opposite question, because Slack has always been a somewhat remote company. You're a tech company. You've always embraced people working from where they want to be as opposed to being in an office. What did you learn in the last 2 years that scares you the most? What was revealed to you that you wish to change?
Well, actually, so I'm going to do one little quick correction. Before the pandemic, we had I think 1.5% or 2% of employees were remote.
Okay.
So we weren't hiring outside of, I think we had 15 offices in 10 countries, but it was like New York, the Bay Area, Toronto, Vancouver, Dublin, London, Tokyo, Osaka, and there's probably dozens of people, and usually that was like a privilege of like long tenured employees who had established a bunch of relationships. So this was very shocking, and there wasn't an ideological opposition to people working remotely. It's just it wasn't a question that was forced in any way, and suddenly the pandemic forced it. I don't know, maybe I don't scare easy, but I'm trying to think of what's actually scary. I'll twist the question just slightly.
Please feel free.
And introduce a thought experiment, which I found super valuable about this. So if you go back to March of 2020, and in some parallel universe, we were allowed to commute, use conference rooms, business travel was okay, you could go to the office, but you took away all the software, all of these companies that did well during the pandemic would have just disintegrated. And I hope that that's like rhetorically powerful and convincing for people. But to me, it indicates that sometime over the last couple decades, we switched from a world where the in-person kind of infrastructure that supports productivity and collaboration reversed importance with the digital infrastructure. So this is not in any way in opposition to people getting together in person. I think that's actually, it's really valuable. But it is indicative of a lack of attention and investment. And I guess maybe if I do, this isn't scary, but if it is a fear, it's that we don't sufficiently take advantage of the opportunity that this created to reimagine how we work, because there's so many assumptions that we were going along with that were obviously wrong. I'll use myself. I would not have thought in February of 2020, if everyone just starts working at home, like boom, on a dime, that we would maintain the same levels of productivity. Part of that is just the adrenaline and the craziness of the initial pandemic, but part of it was we actually had what we needed to continue to work together. And hopefully, when you find something that you thought was impossible turns out to be possible, you start to question some of the other assumptions.
So what I hear both of you saying that's really interesting is that there's a real opportunity here. Like there's reason to be excited about what the last 2 years has given us. Now, Mitch, you actually have a very interesting perspective on this. Mitch Berlin is the America's Vice Chair for EY, which is formerly Ernst & Young, and you work with a number of companies in a consulting capacity, CEOs. You guys have actually done surveys to figure out what are hundreds of companies thinking about as they live through the last 2 years, as they're thinking about asking people to come back to the office. What are you finding as you talk to CEOs about the opportunities they see and the things they're scared of?
Yeah, well, what's interesting is, so we interviewed 20,000 employees from about 500 different companies. Clearly, the hybrid work model is here to stay, so anyone out here who is resisting it, resistance is futile, it's here to stay, we're not going backwards. A recession isn't gonna pull us back into the office either. So the majority of the people that we interviewed acknowledge that it's here to stay. The majority of the leadership of those companies acknowledge that they have to pivot and create a work environment that allows for a hybrid work model. What's interesting, though, is it's not a one-size-fits-all. So if you look at Gen X wants to be in the office. They know that they have to build relationships to further their career. Men over 40 years old want to be in the office as well. I'll let you draw your own conclusions as to why that is. And then there's everything else in between. So what we have now is an opportunity for companies and leadership to build a new social contract with their employees and really create a blueprint that's flexible and works for everyone. So if you are that Gen X and wants to be in the office, how can you be in the office, and how do you have technology that allows you to collaborate with people who don't want to be in the office? If you have young children at home, like some of my colleagues up front in the front row who keep reminding me they have young children at home, how can they be at home, take care of their children, and still collaborate with people who want to be in the office or be at their client? So you have to now recreate what it is to work in a way that can adapt to many different models and desires of work.
I'm sorry, Mitch, surely you mean Gen Z, right? Not Gen X.
It was Gen X.
Whoa.
I double-checked that, too. I thought it was Gen Z, and I thought it's actually Gen X.
That's
yes.
interesting. Gen X finally gets a little bit of time in the sun.
Yeah. It's an interesting question, sir, because I double-read. I thought this certainly has to be Gen Z, and it was Gen X. That was a surprise.
And what's interesting is that I feel like a lot of the high-profile messages that we're getting right now, take Elon Musk, for instance, who sent out, I'm sure you guys, a tweet that said, you know, if you're not coming into the office, then you can pretend to work at another company, or I'll assume you're pretending to work at another company. I mean, there is some very doctrinaire approaches to this, right? Some companies that are saying, look, it's my way or the highway. They're not being flexible. And I want to open it up. If you have a question, feel free to raise your hand or a comment. We've got folks with mics. While the people are thinking about that, so let me ask this. So if the future is something where we embrace hybrid, where we have to accommodate different kinds of people, we do need some guardrails around that, right? Particularly around culture. How do we think about culture in an environment in which we don't know that we're going to be able to see each other on a regular basis? We're not going to be able to transmit culture. A lot of that is passive learning. Jackie and Stewart, as you guys think about this in your own companies, Stewart, you mentioned you guys have brought in how many employees during the pandemic?
I think it's 70% of our employees who are hired post-pandemic.
Oh my gosh! And Jackie, you guys have staffed up
Yeah, the company
significantly.
has hired a significant.
So what do? You got a young person or even an old person coming in. You want to make them a Slacker or a Times person. How do you do that without being able to see them?
There are a couple. It's a great question. I mean, since March 2020, the New York Times has hired almost 2,000 people, and so in my mind, I go, that's 2,000 variations of culture walking around. So that's an interesting sort of like thing to wrestle with as a thought exercise. But before I get more specific to the answering your question, I think it's important to pull up a little bit and to talk honestly about what all has happened in 2 years. Like right now, we're talking about the pandemic because that's the ongoing thing that's ever present and more communicable because it's a virus. But what's happened in 2 years? You have civil unrest that we haven't seen since the 60s. Some of you have never experienced it. We've also had, of course, the pandemic. We are now living in a world in the US that is more divisive than it has been, even more so as a result of what all has most recently transpired. And we're talking about culture in a very granular way, making one assumption that I would poke at, which is it was good before, and that there was equal participation before. And so before we start thinking about how do we fix what was, my challenge is let's just start from ground zero and really anchor into what can be, because we're making these huge assumptions that I would argue are false at best.
That's interesting.
In addition to that, we've added all this other grist for the mill, as it were, that would even complicate trying to return to a pre-pandemic culture. So I just want to be honest about that we've got to pick a better starting point before we can even have the conversation.
And let me ask something on that, because I know when we had spoken, you had mentioned that one of the things that in-person prioritize is extroverts. That there is in a meeting that, as we've traditionally gone to them, but before 2 years ago, the loudest personalities often dominated the conversation. And that's changed. How have you thought about that and the opportunities there?
Yeah, it's a huge opportunity. Years ago, I went to a conference about like the world of just the future of life in general as a result of technology. And now I'm like, I wish I had taken down, there was this, I'll tell you what it was. It was this table designed for meetings, and it had every person's assigned a dot. And when you're talking, all the dots would come to you. And so you had a visual of, oh my gosh, I'm dominating the conversation. And so then other people would either jump in or you would flip it to somebody else. But it was a real interesting way to sort of normalize participation. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about what's the in real life individual capacity to do that. And one of the things I will tell you, I think it's going to be important for leaders to be that dot person. To say, Jackie, you're monopolizing the conversation. I haven't heard from Stewart, and I'd like to hear what Stewart has to say. That becomes particularly more important if you're living in a world where some of us are in the room and therefore have that advantage versus there's some of us that are on screen who, unless it's like tap, 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 I've got a point of view.
Right.
And so it all comes back. We can have the enabling technologies for sure, but it has to be a complete mindset shift about how do we have equal participation regardless of where you are physically, in the room or elsewhere.
And I did pick up on the nudge that I need to call in Stewart. But Stewart, let me ask you, because to this point, I mean, what's interesting about Slack is you guys not only lived through this period of unrest and of social change and of the pandemic, but also you got acquired by another company, right? Which even in the best of times presents a bunch of culture issues and challenges and opportunities. How have you guys worked through that? And what have you learned from it?
I'd say we're still working through it. I mean, luckily, it's not like the cultures were polar opposites. There's, it does bring up an interesting point of culture, like the degree of identification people have. And I think for most human beings, work is not going to be the most important facet of their life. And maybe that's family or religion or the sports team that they're a biggest fan of or something like that. But there absolutely is an element of it, and I think for certain companies there's much more, like the self-selection that goes into deciding where you work in certain places is really about the cultural identification of the company. So Slack had very strange, or at least, very unusual values, I would say. Like they were solidarity and craftsmanship and playfulness as the fundamental values of the company. There's more besides that. So you can imagine a very particular type of person was excited about working there, and they would evangelize to the subset of their friends who are most interested in this kind of culture. One thing that's been actually kind of fascinating to watch is because, and this might be a little bit too technical, but Slack, the company, has an instance of Slack which is super hot-rodded. Like we do all of our own testing on ourselves, and it's very complicated. Salesforce has X Slack, like 75,000 employees or so, and they have a much larger Slack instance, but we had to actually keep them separate because we were doing so much experimentation on our own. And there's a thing called Slack Connect, there's shared channels, and we can we have some access to each other. But I feel like that separate instances of Slack has been probably an impediment to like gelling the cultures, but it's also provoked a lot of interesting conversations because I grew up in Canada, and the multicultural value is a little bit in opposition, at least to what people traditionally understand as a melting pot. Like it's more important for immigrants to maintain a separate identity. I don't mean to defiantly do it, but we've used the comparison that I can be a Korean American, I can be a Los Angeles resident, I can be a Californian, I can be a Presbyterian, I can be an American, and there can be many different identities that people consider part of their essence. And it's harder, I think, for people at an acquired company to immediately adopt the norms of an organization that they didn't elect to join.
Yes, that's really interesting. Yeah, sir.
My question is a much more practical one. How do you address the impact that the work at home model will have on the ecosystem that is supported by all of these jobs, like whether it's real estate, the folks who are not knowledge workers who actually go and work, and how do you account for that and the impact that the work at home model will have on these communities?
Did everyone hear that?
We need to.
The mic.
I can just say it louder.
Can I ask my question after?
Yeah, of course, yeah. I'll just repeat it really.
I'll just shout.
Go for it.
The question is the model of work at home, the impact it will have on the ecosystem surrounding each of these jobs, whether it's real estate, the folks who are not knowledge workers who actually have to go to work, and any consideration for that.
Custodial staffs, restaurants.
All of those people, every single person you touch before you get to your office.
Yeah, actually, Mitch.
The ones you touch when you go for lunch, all of those people are not necessarily knowledge workers.
And I promise we're going to come to you. I keep on saying sir and ma'am, and I apologize to do so. I'll just call you you from now on because I don't want to gender anyone unwillingly. Mitch, let me ask you. I mean, this must be something you guys think about with a lot of your clients.
Yeah, it's an interesting. It's a good question. This came up at Milken a couple of months ago when we were there on a panel, and part of it is that when people aren't going to the office, the restaurants are shutting down, the stores are shutting down around them, and those people that used to work there no longer have jobs, and there are whole movements around skilling up those people to do other things in other places. So, to the extent that they can be part of those programs to actually change their skills so they can be more relevant in a hybrid work environment where those stores may not necessarily open, it gives them a new skill set. They still have the skill set they had should things return to somewhat normal where these stores open. But the whole skill up movement is an important movement, particularly now as some of these folks are just out of work because the institutions that they work for are no longer relevant in the communities where they live. I just also wanted to comment on your dot thing because there's some interesting technology out there. So when you think about you want everyone who works in your organization to feel that they're comfortable there and have a home and have affiliation. And when everyone's at work, you can walk around and you can see the person that never gets asked to lunch, never gets taken out for coffee. How do you do the same thing in a virtual work environment? So there is actually technology out there that we use, and it actually tracks email. It doesn't read the email, so this isn't a big brother here, but it tracks emails and who's getting the most emails and who's sending the most emails to identify the key influencers within the ecosystem, but it also identifies those that aren't engaged. So you can actually find those people and figure out how to re-engage them to make sure that there is some sort of affiliation with the organization that they work with, that they're part of clusters or communities that will pull them in and engage them, particularly introverts that aren't inclined to raise their hand and volunteer for things. So,
And our concept of workplace privacy might change as we're working through some of these issues.
When he said it wasn't Big Brother, I'm like, well.
we don't read, there's no reading of the emails. It's the email traffic.
Oh, I know.
I promise.
With the microphone.
Now is it working? Now it's okay. Is it? Okay, there we go. Well, it's fun. Hi, I'm Erin Williams, and I identify as she, her, hers. I can be ma'am. That's fine. I work with MITRE. And I'm also an introvert. So three questions for you. How in this hybrid or remote work environment do you, one, accommodate people who maybe process afterwards and don't think of something even during the conversation? So the dots, during the conversation is one part, but they have a great idea, but it happens next week. How do you engender a sense of belonging, which I think is part of what you're talking about? And how do you ensure that innovation continues to happen? Because I know there's at least lore about running into people randomly and in the coffee shop, and that won't happen as much if you're just going to the meetings that you're scheduled for. So that's my question. Those are my questions. Thanks.
Anyone want to take that one?
I'll take the first one because it's actually really interesting. So Slack launched, became publicly available about 8 years and 4 months ago. And within like 60 days, we had this piece of feedback that was repeated almost verbatim by several people in a row. Hey, I just wanted to thank you so much. I love Slack. My company started using it. I'm really introverted, and I like to take a little bit more time to formulate my thoughts. I don't often speak up in meetings, and now I find I have a chance to contribute. So I think there's definitely a thread there that is something that most organizations should be pulling about taking work that today must be synchronous. So meetings are the kind of principal example, and finding asynchronous alternatives. I don't mean for every meeting, but like one thing that happened during the pandemic was all we had was this hammer of 30-minute Zoom calls, and so all the world looked like 30-minute Zoom nails. And so we need a wider spectrum of tools because there's a bunch of challenges, at least in certain circumstances. One is just, this was a great meeting, amazing, let's do exactly the same thing a week from now so that you can invite these 3 people who weren't there. So if you can find asynchronous alternatives that allow us to kind of collate a bunch of the same information, register the same contributions, then I think people would be comfortable skipping meetings, but also people who weren't there could get caught up much more easily. So that's both on the tool side. I mean, Slack's doing a lot, but there's a whole bunch of interesting companies doing all kinds of interesting work, and I think we'll have a new set of tools that go into that standard quiver of like email, calendar, word processor, spreadsheet. There'll be a couple more, but it's also something that organizations have to deliberately invest in and kind of create that discipline. Because if you have 2 alternatives, one is like, I'm gonna carefully write out my thoughts and then edit them for clarity and concision. And the other one is just, let's just get on the phone or let's just have a meeting. This is vegetables and this is candy. And so people have a tendency to go for that candy.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Jackie.
Yes, I want to go back to this, might call you gentlemen, just again, not wanting to gender, to this gentleman's question. Because so to your point, I process in a delayed, like pause manner on some things. And so that question has continued to linger even though we've moved on from it. So partly, this is another one where I go, it's important to have some intellectual honesty about there is a thing of the haves and the have-nots. At the times, we never really closed down completely. There were men and women and people who identified differently at our facility printing the paper. You can't do that in a remote fashion. That's just what it is. And the likelihood of our ability to upskill them to do different jobs really are low at best. And in that instance, the best we could do was to protect them. So make testing available at work, make immunization available at work, try to maintain all of the protocols as determined by the CDC. So all in that instance we could legitimately do is take care of them, but there isn't a way to do that work remotely, nor will there ever be, at least not in the foreseeable future. So I don't know that I have an answer so much as I observe what you observe in terms of this is one of those dividing moments of what about people that cannot work from home? That's not the nature of the job. So I just want to at least acknowledge that it didn't disappear. It's in my head too. And then to the series of questions that you asked, Madam, since you don't mind being called that, there are a couple of things to say. I mean, the preponderance of preference for extroverts is not something that can easily be, I think, addressed either pre-pandemic and working together or post. And I think it's great that we have all of these solutions, but at the end of the day, I think work is a human endeavor. And the thing that we often miss is the simple question of, do you need a couple of minutes? Or I know that you might have a continuing thought, come see me afterwards and we can process it together. Or leaving the question open long enough for people to participate. And that's not something that you mechanize, that's just sort of being human and aware that I've got people. And the other thing I will tell you is I would consider myself a high-functioning introvert. Like, my desire is always to stay home, like literally leave home like this, like don't make me go. And then I go out and have this amazing time because I have a rule, if you're not gonna be like wildly entertaining, just stay home, no one's gonna miss you. But people know that about me, and so I'm able to articulate that. I can say no when people understand, like, her batteries are low, it's not personal. But we have to investigate people on a person-to-person basis to get that. A practical way, going back to how you framed your question earlier, one way that companies have done this with interviews is we send you the interview questions and you can write them back, because some people just aren't good at the whole moment, eye-to-eye contact. It takes into consideration that people are on a spectrum as far as neurodiversity is concerned. And so just even reconceiving how we do something as sort of static as an interview, do you need to see them, or can you just give them a homework assignment and have them come back, or do the interview in a way that's more comfortable for them in the event that the panel interview is too much in terms of sensory overload. So again, just coming back and just thinking about human to human, because a fool with a tool is still a fool, right? So we got to get the right inputs before we start trying to mechanize and technologize everything. Like, some of it is just person to person.
I want you to know, now whenever we hang out, I'm gonna think about being wildly entertaining. That's gonna be like, otherwise I gotta leave. Mitch, let me ask you on this belonging question, then we'll go to some questions. But I wanna get your take on this, because you guys are a consulting firm. When you hire a consulting firm, in many ways you are hiring kind of the culture, right? You're hiring an approach. And my understanding is that much of that teaching of new consultants, which happens every single day, is done at dinner after the client engagement. It's done in the meeting where you say, shut up, now's not the time to ask a question, or you encourage someone. How have you guys, as you're transmitting, you have a lot of turnover, you have bringing in a lot of new people. How do you transmit that stuff that doesn't happen quite as easily in person now?
Yeah, so we'll bring in about 75,000 new employees a year worldwide. And the key really there, it's crazy. But the key, you really got to break bulk and create small clusters and communities so people feel comfortable asking questions and being vulnerable. When we say hybrid work environment, it doesn't mean completely work from home. We still bring people into the office when we do our trainings. We want to do some of our trainings in person so people actually get to meet each other, get to know each other. We rely on an apprenticeship model. We have not figured out how to have a 100% virtual environment and a successful apprenticeship model, because if Stewart has done something for the last 3 years, and I know Stewart because we sit next to each other, I can say, Stewart, how do you do this? And he can show me. But if I never met Stewart, I only met him through video chats, it's unlikely that I'm going to have that person to ask that question to, so I'm wasting time cycling through something, getting frustrated, et cetera. So we still need to bring people together side by side, but this is part of that new social contract around what is the hybrid work environment. Right. We're okay with you working from home, but when you have to come in for a meaningful experience, we need you to come in for that, as long as you feel safe coming in. Safety is first and foremost, but if you feel safe coming in, we want you to come in, but they have to be for moments that matter. There's no point coming in and sitting in front of your computer. You can do that at home. But if there's an interaction, a training, and an apprenticeship moment, we want you to come in for that if you feel safe.
What I hear all three of you saying is that, to answer your question on belonging, is that you have to be deliberate about it, which of course we had to be before too. It's just a number of companies didn't, because they had the luxury of being in person. Okay.
And I just want to put a fine point on it. Belonging means something different to different people. Because if you rush an introvert, you have done the opposite of making them feel like they belong. Right?
Absolutely. Erica, let's come up here. And then, sorry.
Hi, Charles. Hi, Erica Kesman. I'm a workplace strategist and author of a book called Bring Your Human to Work, which, Stewart, doesn't have to be your actual human. And my question is going back to, Charles, your question about the onboarding. I mean, 75,000 people, 70% of your people, and even 2,000 people. Can you get very specific and granular? How do you onboard people during this? I mean, the first day used to be you show up, you get the keys, and you figure out where the bathroom is, and what happens on the first day, the first week, the first month? And I ask it because there's data that shows that there is a correlation between deliberate and intentional onboarding and future employee engagement, turnover, belonging, all the things you're talking about.
So I'm happy to start with that. So we're fortunate in the sense that we onboard people in tranches. They're generally, our interns were all onboarded 3 weeks ago. Our full-time hires, MBAs and undergrads are all going to be onboarded July, August, and September. So we do have, again, a hybrid model where we do bring people in person for a little bit so they can get to know each other, and then a lot of it is remote training. What we're doing this year, what we're experimenting with, is actually doing onboarding in the metaverse. And so there will be an EY office in the metaverse where we will actually, as leaders, agree to keep office hours where you can come into my office at a certain time, and I will be there and engage whoever's in the office, and other leaders will do that as well. So everyone around the country can actually have an in-person conversation with me or my avatar. And then it'll be open, then there'll be videos of all of the leaders. So if you want to do it on your own time when we don't have office hours, you can go into my office, click on my video, and learn something about me, my interests, et cetera. So we're starting that up in August and very excited to see how all that works.
I can't wait to come. I'm gonna be the green ogre that comes into your office. Stewart, so what happens on the first week at Slack?
Yeah, that's it's a fascinating question because before the pandemic, regardless of where in the world people were working, we flew them to San Francisco for a full week, and we had this very intensive program. And part of it is like your healthcare, you get laptop, security, blah blah blah, all that stuff. But that was not really that important. I think the bulk of the onboarding was built around a belief that the difference in performance between the best and the worst performing individuals is, let's say this. The difference in performance between the best and worst performing teams is like extraordinary. And it has to do with the degree of trust and therefore the amount of communication required to get anything done, how we come to understand objectives, how people come to understand their roles. So it's an area that I think we probably still underinvested in, but invested much, much more than our peers. And in March 16th, 2020, there was we had, I think, 700 on-site interviews scheduled for new candidates over the next 8 weeks. There was all of these classes, people who had their tickets that were coming. And so we had to reinvent all of those. And I think the team has done an exceptional job, and I think we invest a lot more than most organizations in how to effectively communicate, how to run meetings, how to be better collaborators. And I guess the last thing I would say is really, this is something that I wish every organization would take away. Slack's mission publicly was to make people's working lives simpler, more pleasant, and more productive. But we really internalized that, so people should continually be trying to find ways to make their colleagues' working lives simpler, more pleasant, more productive. And that's a huge spectrum. That could be here's how to, writing a user manual for how to work with me. That could be kind of contracts within a team about responsiveness and when decisions get made. Because if most organizations, and I put Slack in this as well, if you look at all of the intelligence and creativity and talent and experience among all the employees, how much of that is effectively utilized towards the accomplishment of the organization's objectives? If I'm totally honest, it's 15%, 10%. I don't mean that because people are dumb or something like that. I just mean humans are very hard to coordinate. And if you've ever tried to decide what movie to go see when there's a bunch of family for Thanksgiving, and then you just end up not seeing the movie, that's what human beings are like. So I think it's an area where there's no one is even close to over-investing.
And I will say, for anyone who doesn't know, Slack is genuinely, everyone I know who works at Slack genuinely feels like this culture and this mission is very real. In fact, I'll actually mention, I believe that when you were born, your birth name was Dharma. Is that right?
It's absolutely.
So it comes from the top. You're in Aspen. I live in Santa Cruz. Respect. Jackie, let me ask you. So when I started at the New York Times, my first week, we went to a series of meetings where editors would tell us who they hated in the newsroom. and then usually their sexual histories, which I don't think you can do at this point. So now that I'm showing up, if I'm a new employee, it was a newsroom. It was a good time. What happens now, the first day, first week at the New York Times?
Yeah, I mean, so I don't have anything that's particularly value added beyond what our colleagues here have already said. What I will tell you is I make it a discipline to talk to other CHROs. And again, back to the spirit of we don't need to over-design what it means to be connected to another human being. The thing that I think most organizations miss is I need a buddy. I need a person that knows my name and for whom there's an expectation that I can call them and get the simplest, most mundane question answered. And so we can do all these other elaborate things, and they're important, but they're is necessary but insufficient, right? Yeah. The one thing I will tell you, but I'm personally looking forward to it now that we've reopened to an extent, is taking our new hires to the facility where the paper comes hot off the press. I mean, every organization has something that it rotates around, and you program around that. I want even the person who works in custodial services to feel the pride of, I help put a paper out, a physical thing that people all over the world are going to read. And so what's that thing for every organization? And start there and build out.
Well, what I hear all three of you saying is some aspect of psychological safety.
Oh, yeah.
That creating psychological safety, which of course was important before. But
Although that phrase has its problems as well. Yeah. I mean, we're not in the Ukraine. Those people are psychologically unsafe. We're uncomfortable. So I don't want to sort of make it like...
It's so important. I'll tell you, we had a town hall for junior people 2 weeks ago, and 150 people RSVP'd, 25 showed up. And when we did research as to why they didn't show up, it's because they didn't feel comfortable coming in and meeting because they didn't know anyone. They've been there for a year. They've never been in the office. They haven't met people. It was intimidating for them to come to a meeting. You forget when you were young and had meetings that were intimidating because leadership was there, you'd find a buddy and go to. They didn't have anybody, so they just didn't show up.
In the blue shirt, yeah. If you don't mind running the mic down, thank you. Oh. Which up?
So you're head of the facilities committee at your firm, and in 2000, let's say 19 or 20, you occupy 500,000 feet, and the CEO said to you, we need new square footage. We need to go get new space, and so you were thinking about a new headquarters building. And now, fast forward, you're 3 years later. How are you advising your leadership about making a new 30-year commitment to space?
They have the bigger numbers.
Yes, 7,000 new employees a year. Tell me. Yeah. And should we get your leasing agents in here?
Well, yes. I hope we're not signing 30-year leases to start with, but I don't have a direct answer to that question, but I know that the space that we have, we are rethinking how to use that space to create better collaboration hubs for people when they do come into the office. So, our offices are no one has an office anymore. You have hoteling space. No one's allowed to use a conference room unless they have more than two people in it. There are a bunch of little living room setting areas where people can come in and sit down and gather more. So I don't have a direct answer on the economics of it, but I can tell you that we are completely rethinking how we use our offices. So when people do decide to be in the office, it's the best experience they can have. And food is very important too, we know now. And this is from our friends in Silicon Valley that have taught us the power of snacks.
A bunch of questions.
I'll do something really quick because we're cutting down time and a lot of hands up. But our headquarters in San Francisco got like a 10-story building. It's like all glass. It's got a big logo on the side. And if you think about the purpose of us having that, going back pre-pandemic, it's a projection of power. It's an advertisement for us. It's a place to bring recruits and impress them. It's a place to bring customers and impress them. There's these all hands events. There's training sessions. There's like really interesting collaborative meetings going on. And then by square footage, there's like 80%, which is dedicated to like factory farm battery chicken housing for people to sit and use their laptop by themselves and not talk to anyone, sometimes even with headphones on. That part they can do anywhere. Like that, in retrospect, that was a waste of the square footage, and we don't have the perfect plan for how to reimagine that space. But definitely, the ratio is going to shift from 20% of large open spaces and spaces for people to have meetings and all of that to like inverted. there are, and this is something we didn't really get to before, there are lots of people who are fresh out of college for whom work is a bigger portion of their social life, who want to get into the office, people whose homes don't support them, or at least both them and their spouse also have simultaneous video calls. There's, like, in Japan, it's very different, like just the built environment is not set up for people to be at home all day. So there's a whole bunch of populations that do want to come back to the office all the time, and then there's populations like me. I moved here during the pandemic in December of 2020. I have a 13-month-old, and the experience of those first 13 months, very different than it would have been if that, a couple of years prior. So I think there's people who are never going to go back Monday to Friday, 9 to 5, and the real estate industry will be okay in the end, and we'll figure out. Same thing with all those dry cleaners and pharmacists and restaurants. Sorry.
Sir, right here in the burgundy.
Yeah, I'm going to make a link back to something Jackie referenced about previous issues that maybe haven't been addressed. So think back, obviously, folks get burned out because we're always on based on our digital context. So as you think about the hybrid work environment, how are we starting to think about that and address it? Because we didn't kind of address it, but now we have this other thing on top of it. Because people are always on with kids and all the other stuff at home. How are we thinking about addressing that?
If you don't go to the office, you never leave the office. I'm sure all three of you have thought about this.
So
Jackie?
technically that color is ox blood, just to say that. But I couldn't resist.
No, I appreciate it.
It's an important question. This is another one where I go, again, it's the arrogance is the wrong word, and is saying more than I mean, but there's a paternalism sometimes associated with some of this. Like, I have to self-regulate, right? I've got to have personal agency to say at 6 o'clock, I'm taking this down, I'm gonna go have dinner with my family, and maybe I'll come back at 8. Like, I have to do that. And so partly one of the learnings I've had during the pandemic is the degree to which employees love and hate being told what to do. And I think coming out of the pandemic, I'm doubling down on treat people like adults, right? And one of the things I really enjoyed when I was in the consulting field is that you always had the deliverable to tie back to. Here's what I need. Now we can talk about what you need to do it, when you need it. You could be in Tahiti for all I care, but the client needs this on this day. What do you need to make sure that happens? And I think we have to absorb a little bit of that as we go back into the office. I do, and again, it goes back to leadership as well. All of the email functions, like I sometimes will get up in the middle of the night with an idea and I send an email. I delay send it. Just because I'm thinking about it doesn't mean I need you to respond to me right away. The same thing is no one is forcing your phone in the bedroom with you. Take it out of the bedroom. Stop checking email. Like, I have literally had days where I go, I'm just going to take an hour away. And to my astonishment, nothing broke. Like, nothing at all. And so sometimes I think we just have to tell our employees, you need to be more vocal about what you need to maintain a level of effort that you can sustain and not burn out. But we have to be careful not to take all of that on. It's impractical.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I don't know if either of you have...
I mean, this was our biggest complaint for the first 6 months of COVID, that no one could take off. Like, you were there 24/7. So we ended up having to really become very deliberate around when we're scheduling time, when we send emails. My friend Zoe in the front audience was on vacation. We actually deleted her from invites that she had been on. She was pissed and thought that something was going on here, but we didn't want her logging in on her vacation. So we actually deleted her from the invite. So you have to be very, very deliberate.
And also communicate why.
Yeah, we probably should have told you beforehand. We should have told you.
Mention you're fired.
We should have mentioned it beforehand. Didn't want to ruin your vacation. But by far, hands down, the biggest complaint. No one can disconnect.
Gotcha. Stewart, I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on this?
No, I'm good. We've got one more.
Okay. We got time for one.
Oh my gosh.
Can we go over here?
Absolutely.
Please, it's sorbet green.
Yes. Is it sorbet? I'm going to rely on you.
Thank you. My name is Eric. I'm part of the Basil Scholars Program.
Oh, great.
I'm going to shift it a little from Gen X to Gen Z. And my question is, and she kind of proposed it to me, as young people who are kind of used to Zoom and kind of being asynchronous for such a long time, what does it mean for young people like us to adjust to a social norm if we don't really know what it means? And I guess a second part to that is, how will younger generations be able to, to kind of communicate with people in real life and find jobs, organizations, and companies if we're kind of used to.
It's a good question, right? We're all kind of out of practice.
I would like to say, the festival organizers, this is a discussion topic next time.
Yes.
I mean, I think I'm glad you bring it up because I do think that the tendency is to over-rotate on the older generation. I hope no one takes offense to that. I define old as 15 years older than you. So, like, it keeps rolling. But it's an important question. And things like, I was really intrigued by your mention of Meta and how the metaverse and how you're going to use it. I think there's a lot of room on both sides to, like, what's the middle ground? Because to your point, you're native to the technology. Being on Zoom is not like this thing for you, whereas for those of us who are slightly older, it's like the biggest thing. Like, if I gotta get on the screen one more time today, I don't know what I'm gonna do. But I do think it's a topic that we should invite the younger people in to weigh in because we're problem solving without their input.
Absolutely.
Which is
and Stewart, for our final comment, if you don't mind, because the question that you asked makes me think Slack actually did invent a new way of communicating, right? You guys were part of this shift for younger employees who've spent their entire life with Slack and asynchronous communication.
Yeah,
How do you think about this?
I don't think you should worry about it too much. Certainly, depending on what age people are, they had some in-person schooling during the course of their lives, and it's not so different to be in an office and together meeting with people. I don't think there's you're probably better prepared than the opposite, which is I did 30 years of my career in person, walking over to people's desks, and now I'm having to confront this new technology. But I would say earlier, there's more tools that are required. I don't know. How old are you? 17, okay. So for me, being on camera for 8 hours a day is exhausting because I can't pick my nose. Like I can't, if I'm on a phone call, you can be doing 3 things at the same time. Like you can be having another conversation, you're mouthing to someone, and you can be like reading when you're bored. You can really tell when someone's typing on their computer or reading something when they're on a Zoom. I think we need more, like a bigger spectrum of means to communicate. So obviously Slack has a lot of written language, but also just I record my thing and send it to you later. Now we can get the transcript of it. We can index that for search. You can read the transcript or click on a line, jump to that point in the video, audio only tools, and a whole bunch of other stuff that will give people kind of the best of the technology so that when they're in person, we can do the stuff that's most important or easiest to do in person. And I think that's establish relationships, build trust, come to understand each other a little bit deeper. And that's really an accelerant for everything we do with the digital tools.
Well, I want to thank all 3 of you. This has been fascinating. I feel like I've learned a lot. Thank you to the audience for joining us. And I hope everyone is very excited about the new world and ready to plunge in. Thank you all.